Okay, the beginning of the end. We're really, really proud to have Charity Majors and Fred Hebert as a closing keynote. Charity was first suggested by Fred, but many, many years ago, before they were colleagues, when he was actually on the program committee for this very conference. And when Charity's name kind of came up again this year, a lot of people's faces kind of lit up. And yes, yes, yes. And then from there, we thought, why don't we pair her up with Fred so we get Fred out of retirement? He's not been and attended one of these conferences since 2019. For those of you who don't know, well, Charity, she is the co-founder and CTO of Honeycomb. She's worked at Facebook and Linden Labs, companies which I think are well known to us for using Erlang. And yeah, Fred, well, Fred in these circles doesn't need that big of an introduction.
Fred Herbert.
Yeah, Fred Herbert, yes, exactly. With an accent québécois, maybe we should pronounce it, yes. But yeah, he's written Learning from Erlang for Great Good. He's property-based testing with Erlang and Elixir, Erlang in Anger. And yeah, he currently works at Honeycomb as a site reliability engineer. And yeah, together they'll talk about social technical elements that make good platforms. So let's hear it for them. Welcome.
Thanks for having us. This is the first time Fred and I are actually getting to work together on something. Didn't think it would be a talk, but...
It's the second time. My first week on call, we got a page. I didn't know what to do. I escalated, and Charity got paged, came in at like 4 in the morning, had no idea that none of her keys still worked. Like, let's figure this out. But yeah, first week on call, the CTO comes in to help me. Yeah, that's the second time we work on something.
First time it was the CTO had broken something. That tracks, that tracks. Cool. It's an honor, it's an honest tradition that I'm proud to carry on. All right. Thanks for the lovely introduction. It was really fun. Looking forward to this. First, let's start with some definitions. Socio-technical, grabbed this definition from Wikipedia. Basically, it's saying that you've got people, you've got technology, and all the stuff that we work on all day, you can't neatly separate them. You can't be like, oh, I just do the technology. Oh, I just do the people stuff. Or if you try, I'm guessing you will do a pretty bad job because it kind of doesn't work that way anymore. Platform, as my old boss said, a platform is a thing you put stuff on, right? I liked that definition, never forgotten it. We're actually referring to the platform engineering movement in tech, just to be clear. And what that means, great platforms have these elements. The platform team, a good platform, has a high-performing team. It also enables and unlocks, I think, a different level of performance than previous movements do. One of the defining things about platform engineering is that their customers are internal engineering teams, where every engineer writes code and supports the code that they write. And instead of having a team who is on call for you, you have a team who supports you in being on call for yourself. This is a groundbreaking, novel idea, the idea that engineers are people too, and that applying principles of design and usability to the tools that we use ourselves might actually help. Jury's still out. Not sold, but we'll see. And I think very importantly, they do as little infrastructure work as possible. They do as little work as possible. And I say that somewhat snarkily, but also in full seriousness, because I think that successful platform engineering teams don't own large bodies of software. They kind of sit between vendors who build and sell software, and their own internal teams, which build software, and they try to be a thin, gluey, connective tissue. Because as soon, like they automate things, right? But as soon as your platform engineering team starts building and having to support a corpus of software, that takes a lot of time, and it's a different rhythm. I think platform engineering teams can't also successfully own large bodies of software. That's not their role.
If you're having customers, there's a set of core numbers of innovation tokens you want to put on some specific technology, and that's the thing you build and operate. The rest is less important by definition.
Exactly.
You want to own less of that.
Exactly. Outcomes associated with great platforms. This is not exactly going to be mind-blowing to anyone here who's been paying attention to the DORA report for the past 10 years. But there's an extra one here.
Yeah, I wanted to be really concerned about how you react to outages. There's a general pattern of if you're having an incident, downtime, you yell at people until they make it go away. You want the system to be up, that needs to go. And the reaction you have between embracing the failure and celebrating the work people have done to improvise and do good stuff is going to have a big influence down the road on whether people share and want to learn or whether they hide and cover their ass in what they do. And so on top of how quick you do things, there's a qualitative value of what are you trying to learn from the adverse events you're going through.
At Linden Lab, you mentioned Linden Lab, and we actually had this tradition there, which I loved, I cherished, but when we tell people about it now, they're like, oh my God, you did what? Where after you broke production the first time, you would put on a pair of Shrek ears, like from the movie Shrek. And people are like, oh my God, they think it was like a dunce cap or something, but it wasn't. Remember, I'm old enough that this was before DevOps, before blameless retros, before all these things, and it was a way that we were like, congratulations. If you never break production, you probably aren't working on anything really serious.
It's like a birthday hat, it's a rite of passage.
Exactly. And you'd put on the ears, and people would be like, oh, tell me the story. And then they tell you about the first time they broke production. And it was a way to socialize lore and make it okay to fail, right? Make it be we all fail. In fact, the best outages always come from the most senior people. So you can't separate social from technical stuff, but the entry point for looking at the sort of human side of these is teams, I think, because teams are the smallest unit of software ownership. We have a term for individuals who own code. We call them single points of failure. Teams own code. A team is the abstraction interface for the rest of the company. People get sick. People go on honeymoons, people take vacations, and the team needs to be able to go on owning and operating and fixing bugs and, fixing things. And so the team, when you're talking about software ownership, you need to start with teams, not individuals. No technology, arguably all technology is bad technology to varying degrees of bad. Good teams can make it work. Bad teams can't be saved by good technology. And when it comes to, people ask me for advice in their careers sometimes, and my go-to piece of advice is look for a great team, a healthy team with people you want to learn from. Teams define careers.
Yeah, I've been doing this for 15, 17 years now. I've had multiple jobs. And when I look back in my experience, there's one or two companies or one or two teams specifically where you sort of go back there and you always reference the stuff you were doing, and it's this was special. This was a unique moment in time. You cannot replicate that, but there's lessons that we can grab from this and try to apply everywhere else. And for every job that I've had, this generally didn't happen. There's a few places where it goes, and everyone sort of remembers them dearly when they happen to them.
Yeah, and those people tend to stay in touch.
Yes, and hire each other.
Super true, super true. I was lucky enough to have a job like that, my very first job in tech. And I consider myself very fortunate because I've had shitty jobs in tech. And I didn't stay at them because I knew it wasn't supposed to feel like that. I knew it wasn't supposed to feel shitty, so I left. And Honeycomb, we just passed our 9-year anniversary, you can believe it? Thank you. Never would have guessed. The early years were rough. They were rough. And Christine, my co-founder, and I would sometimes look at each other and go like, you know, if all we ever managed to do is for the people who worked here, if we get to set the bar high so that the people who've worked here won't accept shitty jobs for the rest of their career, this will all have been worth it. It makes such a difference.
Yeah, and this is the apprenticeship industry.
It's an apprenticeship industry, right? The great team. All right, let's say that again. This is an apprenticeship industry. Thank you. We were all junior. Some of us maybe still are. We never stop learning, right? That's the thing that makes this industry both challenging and so gratifying, is you never reach a point where you're like, okay, done, got it. I've had 2 really bad jobs in my life, actually. Each of them, I was young enough and naive enough to think that I owed them a year of my life, so I stayed at each of them for a year and a day. They were different in like mirror opposite ways. The first one was like Silicon Valley, cutting edge technology, mobile, you know, all this stuff, Stanford bros and stuff, where my first clue that it was a terrible place to work was when we had to work all night to get a mobile release cut to something, something. The CEO comes in at 5 a.m. with like donuts, like, oh, this is so cool. Overnighters, this is real Silicon Valley shit. And I'm just like, you're praising people for this. You're gonna get this every time. And guess what? They did. So after that, I was like, I know what I want. I want a place where, with good people, you know, in the city where I can walk to. I found a place like that. And it had all the things I was looking for. And it was terrible in exactly the opposite way. Old tech, Perl-based service. Sorry, nothing to shit on Perl, but this was within the past 30 years. So, sorry, that was a dig. That was not nice. Very nice people, but doing everything by hand, you know. And it was, I'll be honest, the closest I've ever gotten to burning out in tech was at the easiest job I ever had to do with the least amount of work. So it was just like, what is the point? You know, falling asleep at my desk. Very different jobs. What they had in common, they all made me feel like that. What's the point? You know, if any of you are out there just like cringing, like, oh God, the part of the slide, I'm sorry, no job is perfect, right? Every single job is gonna have elements from like both of these, but like, I think what stands out about bad jobs, what stands out about good jobs, like, it's when you take a step back, like, how did you feel most of the time while you were there? That's what matters. So how do we build high-performing teams? Great question. Glad you asked. Obviously, cheapest, seniorist engineers you can get, and from Facebook, Google,
Yeah.
Top talent there. All right, you already know it. You know it's better than that. Not even gonna try and fake it. How do we build high-performing teams? You build an environment where growth is the norm, where learning is the baseline. We select for, we have a coding interview at Honeycomb where, you know, you do like an hour-long exercise, but the real interview, in my opinion, is after that, when you talk through it. You do a code review exercise with folks. You just talk through, here's what I did. Here's what I thought of doing. Here's what I didn't have time to do. Here's what I would do. Here's what I learned. Just like, tell us. Because if you can tell us how you think through a problem, you can figure the code out.
You might work on a really hard algorithm like once or twice a year, and if your entire interview process is based on doing that, then 95% of the job you never test for in your interview process.
Good point. There are plenty of people out there who can talk you through the problem. Sorry, if you can talk through the problem, you can do the work. The reverse is not true. There are plenty of people out there who can do the problem and who can't talk you through that. And some of that often is just like they haven't had, it's not been part of their job, right? This is a learnable skill, just like anything. But for us, communication is so fundamental. We're a distributed company. We need to spend we need to spend even more time intentionally communicating about the work that we do. Communication, humility, collaboration. You reward curiosity. You reward people for caring. Some of this is about having good tools. Some of it's about, like Fred was saying, not just pouncing on people when they get things wrong. Diverse teams are more resilient teams. Monocultural teams can outperform diverse ones in a short term sometimes. But someone gets sick, someone gets pregnant, you start to scale, you have to integrate other cultures. When you make diversity a baseline value from the beginning, your team is more resilient. There's a lot of backlash out in the world right now about a lot of this stuff, and I think it's so short-sighted. Building an inclusive culture broadens the talent base you can draw from. It raises the bar for literally everyone.
And if the only thing you can do is hire very senior or staff engineers to work at your place, the kind of thing that happens is that you're reaping the rewards from other organization that trains them, and you're dependent on them to do your work. What tends to happen if you're not able to hire someone who's a bit more junior and level them up is that what you're probably seeing is that your senior people are succeeding despite your culture, not because of it. If you want really all the kinds of people that you have to succeed, you're able to train them up and build them up. That's a sign that you're able to actually do good stuff and let people work to their best selves.
The work that you put into your socio-technical system to help people come up to speed, right? Whether you're onboarding new folks, training junior engineers up, letting engineers move around from team to team, the work that you put into it gets reused over and over and over and over again. I love the way Fred puts it. Your senior people, if you don't make socio-technical systems that people can navigate and learn, then they're probably succeeding in spite of you. I feel like there's so much competition out there for world-class engineers, quote unquote, world-class engineers, right? But the best engineering orgs in the world are the ones where perfectly normal engineers with a normal amount of experience, background, skills, can move the business forward every single day. And yes, those are actually the ones that mint world-class engineers. At the other side of that, like no one's business, because nobody is born a great engineer.
You're a much healthier business if you're bleeding senior engineers because you keep hiring juniors and they level up and move on to somewhere else, and if you do the opposite and you keep hiring seniors and losing the juniors you're trying to get.
Yes, if your seniors are getting hired away because Netflix will pay them top dollar, like no one can compete with Netflix, right? Good for them. Everyone involved wins. This is a systems problem.
Yeah. This is a little bit of a diagram of what the honeycomb architecture looked like in 2021 when I joined. It was kind of simple. It's not the biggest thing. There's a bunch of services, there's core stuff. We were at the size back then where we had like one platform team and one engineering team for product, and everyone was on call for all the things. You could sort of understand all the bits. It started being confusing, but we were able to do that. But over the course of the last 4 years, you gain more customers. You see more things that can explode. You try to address them. You have to build new features and whatnot to stay competitive because the landscape keeps evolving. And last year, like our architecture diagram looked a bit like this. If you go on the website, it's still roughly the same thing where you send us data and you are able to query it. But there's a ton more services that are in there, a lot more connections, a lot more ways things can fail. And we've had to add components. This is complexity. It is not accidental complexity. It is essential complexity. Because people use you and whatever feature you give them creates new expectations. You have to meet them constantly. You have to keep the system going so it works. If tomorrow you go to your workplace and you go, we're going to do a code freeze for 5 years, you're out of business. You know it's a bad idea. You need to keep moving all the time, and adding complexity is the sort of natural outcome of that. Accidental complexity is usually essential complexity that's just a bit older, but you needed it at some point. It was part of the process. The other thing that you grow is that you need to have more people in your organization. The only way you go from this system on the left to the one on the right is not by just yelling at the machines until they grow, although that is somewhat possible with some autoscalers.
Also fun.
Yeah. You need actual people to look into them, to build a support network to do it, to talk to each other, to repair the understanding of things that were happening and are no longer making sense. And the stability of your system, once again, is an ongoing act. If you stop doing anything, it falls down. It's not that the system is a rock that is stable until you push it over. It's a spinning plate that you keep spinning all the time, and that's part of the reason why you need your people to be there to keep it working. Part of it is, like the way people talk to each other is almost like a protocol in a distributed system. They are components. They interact with them. If you remove the people on the top here who are doing important work, something breaks in the system. They are a fundamental component, and that's why they are socio-technical.
Transparency is one of the most important. It's like, it's tests, it's validation for your organization. People feel safe asking each other questions. Do they feel safe giving honest answers? Do they have access to the information that they need about what the business's priorities are? Do they have access to the information they need about who to escalate to?
If two teams don't trust each other and don't talk to each other, it's a kind of organizational split brain, the same you would have in a distributed system outage. But yeah, part of the problem that you have as well is that, like, because this is a growing system, and this is a diagram from 2024, I don't know that I could draw the diagram for 2025 anymore, because like the complexity means that it doesn't fit in anyone's head anymore. Anyone has this sort of local point of view of things where they're trying to do their best, and you're really just going as much as you can with the information you have. But this increase in complexity ends up like changing how predictable your systems are. If you can't see the whole thing, you can't predict the whole thing. Even if you have runbooks, if you had procedures, if you have processes, if you have standardization, at some point they reach their limits because the knowledge or the context has shifted, and you need people to be able to improvise, bend, or break, or change the rules. And so that's where you need people to be their most creative selves to be able to do that, access the information, find what's broken, and feel like they have the ability to change it and then do it in a way that makes sense for the organization.
Do we still do that thing where after you've been hired, you're the next one to draw the architecture diagram?
I think we did it for a while, but at some point we started hiring too fast to do it for every session. But when we started, that was the thing. You joined, and next 2 weeks or something, there was a new architecture session, and you were the one teaching it. And you were expected to get it wrong. You were just sat with Ben, which is one of the most senior engineers, and he would correct it for you and sort of teach you as you taught everyone. But that was like the rite of passage back then. What was interesting is that everyone gives you a very, very different architecture diagram. They all have to do with the same system. It's the same code, but they all have a different representation. And that speaks sometimes to the sort of diversity that you have in your understandings, where if people understand all these things differently, that's when you get into weird-ass incidents that nobody knows what happens. But once you have everyone in the room, you sort of figure it out. Like, nobody can do it alone, but with everyone and the varying perspectives, you're able to do something that makes sense. But what you need to do when you have these growing organizations with people who understand all different bits of things is you need to align ownership. You cannot have centralized decision-making in your architecture, in your systems, where like one click of very old engineers who have been there a long time say yes and no to all the things. Teams need to own their own reliability in code in production. They need to be on call for it. They are given the tooling, however, and support to understand their code and operate it. You have to give them the right conditions to be able to do that part. Operating it is really, really tiring work. It's undervalued. It burns people out. If you don't support it properly, you're going to have a lot of trouble. It is the finding out part that follows fucking around. And as an organization, you can do a lot of fucking around, but ops is where you do all the finding out.
Writing code news alert, is not the hardest part of software engineering.
Right.
Never
And-
has been.
No. And there are some rules that I think we do that I found very interesting, where if you are on call, you are not expected to do product work. The team has to operate without you for a while. When you're on call, you're there to improve on call. We also made some specific rules where you never have a call rotation with fewer than 5 people. Because if you're on call every 3 or 4 weeks, you enter a death spiral where people exit the organization and you can't hire back. Like, there's a good pacing to be had. And we have a minimum of like 5 people on a rotation, but you also have a maximum of like 8 or 9 people, or 8 to 9 weeks between your shifts. Because if you're on call like twice a year, every time is very stressful. You are never current. It's like exercise. There needs to be a good pacing. There are such things as good incidents because they keep you current and up to date in having your ownership. Like, you need to do the finding out part from time to time. If you don't improve your decisions.
There's also at one point we had sort of an SLO for incidents, out of hours incidents. And if you'd exceeded that number, then someone else would, we've played around with a few different things. I'm not super up on this, but like, I do feel like I remember when I started tweeting about putting software engineers on call in 2015, 2016, and people got mad. I didn't become a software engineer to get woken up in the middle of the night. People were pissed. I've got kids. I've got and I'm like, yeah, who doesn't? If you're not willing to get woken, I get very energized about this. If you're not willing to get woken up for your code, someone's getting woken up for it. Someone without the context, someone without the intent, somebody's on call back there for that.
Operations never stop.
Never stops. Yeah, no, we've come so far in the past, almost a decade since we started, and we realized that, in fact, putting people on call for the code is the only way to really make it better, because you're hooking up the feedback loop, right? You're connecting the dots. It's the only way.
And instead of asking, what do you need to do to graduate and be senior enough to no longer be on call, the question is, how do we need to make on call the kind of thing you would be okay to do until you retire?
Yes.
And that's a very different question to ask, and it's worth discussing.
Yes. How do we make on call something? I actually kind of like to flip that around. It should be a badge of honor. You know enough, you're senior enough, you can be trusted with the keys to the kingdom. This is what makes, I don't think it should actually be tied to level at all, but it definitely shouldn't be tied to being junior.
And part of the reason why this is also important is a sort of organizational iceberg. You see deploying, alerting, scaling, operations, that's the visible stuff. Every time there's an outage, you look at this, you see a failure, and you go, we need to stamp this out. It needs to happen less often. But the perspective that I really want to have is that these are normal outcomes of your system. They're made up from whatever you do in testing, in the fatigue that you have, in the design that you do, the code reviews that you have, whatever conflicts exist, how you shape up the roadmaps. There's a set of values and pressures that you apply. If you gotta ship fast and you get yelled at if you're late, then people, yes, are gonna take shortcut. Time is limited. There's behaviors that you will to reward. There's our priorities that you have to have. And if you are looking at the top of this iceberg and the only thing you do is you go sink it underwater and not see it, you're not learning from the entire thing that happens. Operations is a sort of point where the way your organization imagines itself making decision meets reality. And the incident is when whatever you thought was happening and what is going on clash and break. And so you have to pay attention to that to repair your understanding of yourself. This is the feedback loop of the organization, and you won't catch anything. Or not catch everything, you'll catch a lot of stuff. But yeah, very important stuff. And part of the challenge that we have when we don't embrace this is that we sort of always do the pendulum between specialization and generalization. You started a while ago with dev, writes all the code, throws it over the fence to ops, who owns infra and just deploys it, and it kind of sucks. And then there was this big movement of DevOps, the people who write the code need to own it. And then the thing that you found is that you still have specializations within a team. Some people like infra more, and some people do more operations and whatnot. And one big team like that doesn't work great. Or what you have is the ops team with dev stapled in front. They don't do a lot of dev anyway. If you do DevOps a whole lot, the thing that you sort of start having is just silo it. There's a lot of stuff you need people to have constrained context, deal with something, and then there's a lot of infra, you have a big layer of glue. And what you end up having at some point is like, that's where you have a platform, which is another subdivision that plays in that balance that you have between them.
Yeah. A lot of times when I hear pushback, they're like, you're asking me to do it all. You're asking me to understand everything. I'm like, oh, grasshopper. Nobody's asking you to go down rack servers. There's a lot that we forget, that we have to go down, like push power buttons, right? But I get it, right? They're right. There are limits. There are cognitive limits to how much, and the broader you go, like the thinner, like it's hard to like do the trick. Is my necklace making noise? Is that me? Is it not bothering anyone? Okay, cool. Dev versus ops was like one of those early stabs at figuring out how to like specialize, and it was a disaster, right? The idea that half of us can write the code and the other half will understand the code was just never going to work. And moving the abstractions from dev plus ops to a model where these feedback loops of you're building it, you know what you're trying to do, you see it, is it doing what I expect it to do, right? Where there's a certain amount of operational, like this works at every step of the stack, right? Whether you're front end or building databases or anything in between. But like part of why platform engineering is so powerful is I think that it does, moving the abstractions from that to that, really does support a higher performing engineering org and culture than was ever actually possible with dev siloed off from ops. By the way, if anyone is telling you that they can sell you platform engineering by buying a product, in the immortal words of the Princess Bride, they're selling you something. What was that?
I haven't seen Princess
You
Bride.
haven't seen Princess Bride? Oh
I
my
grew
God.
up in French.
Oh, I grew up in French. Life is pain, Highness. If anyone tells you anything else, they're selling something. Thank you. When I think about modern development best practices, these are the ones that really come to mind for me. Engineers own their code in production, practicing observability-driven development. And what I mean by this is, in much the way as you're writing your code, you're also commenting or adding docs or whatever, like, what is future me going to need to know, right? You're instrumenting your code as you go, right? You're thinking about someone, eventually, maybe me, is going to get woken up at 2 a.m. to understand, how am I going to understand what's happening, right? You're instrumenting your code as you go, you deploy it, and you close the loop by looking at your code in production through the lens of the instrumentation you just wrote and asking yourself, is it doing what I expect it to do? And does anything else look weird? Technical term, weird. That is like irreducible complexity, right? Like you can't, if nobody's looking at it and closing that loop, if nobody's thinking about how am I going to understand it, can I understand it, right? And there are technical reasons why this has not been, this is much more possible now than it has been in the past. Think about testing in production. I do it, no, I don't. Usually I have test and prod or live a lie on. This one, if you can't read it, says, nines don't matter if users aren't happy. Testing in production, and some people get very spicy about this, but in reality, everyone tests in production. Only some of us admit it. And the first step to doing it well is acknowledging that sometimes you have to do it. And so there should probably be some tooling for it. There should probably be some way to do it that is not, for example, SSHing into a database node and running strace on it. If you don't build to do things well, you will do them poorly. Testing in production can encompass a lot of things. One of them, I think, is separating deploys from releases. There's a lot of great things you can do with feature flags. But I think managing the sort of essential tension between the number one thing we know about how to build reliable systems is to ship smaller changes more frequently, right? This is in conflict with the needs of other parts of the business, like product or marketing or sales, and their needs to, say, release a thing on a date. everyone can get their needs met using feature flags. And continuous deployment. Do we still deploy from cron using my bash script?
We're trying to migrate out of that. It
Cool.
takes a while to do it.
Does. I maintain this is the best line of code I've ever written in my life. 9 years ago, I got really irritated with having to merge, deploy. So I wrote a stupid little bash script that just, if there's a new binary, just pull it down, deploy it out. This is the kind of thing I will grant you is hard. If you didn't develop this way, it's hard to introduce it later. You know the anecdote of Alexander the Great and his horse? His dad gave him a horse when he was a 10-year-old boy or something, and a tiny pony. Or he gave him a tiny pony. The horse was baby. And he told Alexander, pick the horse up every day. And by the time the little tiny pony is a full-grown horse, you'll be able to pick the horse up every day. Does nobody know this story? Nobody knows this story. Well, this is how bash script deploys. Anyway, TLDR.
Yeah.
TLDR. Automatic deployment. In the ideal world, you deploy one engineer's change set at a time, right? Most people don't live in the ideal world, which is fine, right? The point is, the shorter the interval, the smaller the change set, the fewer people's changes are going out at once, the easier it's going to be. What do all these have in common? Fast feedback loops. They're all about accelerating the amount of time between, it's like the most important interval in these complex distributed systems, I think, is the time between when you're writing the code and when it's running in production. The longer it gets, the more you enter like what I think of as like the software development death spiral, where everything, changes batch up, deploys take longer, more people's things go out at once, it takes longer to deploy, something goes out, and now you've got 20 or 30 people who had diffs, and so the rest of their day is screwed until you figure out it's just like, and the longer everything takes, like now you need like specialists to do build and release engineering and SRE, and it's just like, takes more time, you spend more time waiting on each other, you need more manager, it's just like, these are feedback loops, right? Like Fred was saying, these systems are not static.
And even at the development level, if you're running your tests and if your thing is working, takes 10 minutes, you know how weirder it is to develop than if your tests are run in 5 seconds and you can run them multiple times as you type stuff.
Yes.
Like this is true at the small level, this is true in operations, this gets true for decisions made at the business level by the execs as well. Like how long it takes to know the consequences of what you've done is a critical component of learning about anything at all.
Yes. When it comes to software, speed is safety. We're embodied beings, which means when we get shaky or scared, we tend to freeze, like, ugh, right? And we have to train ourselves out of this. And this can be done, right? You learn to ice skate. You learn to ride a bike. You slow down on your ice skates, you fall down, right? Same with software. Speed is safety when it comes to software. And obviously, we work for an observability company, so take this with the requisite grain of salt. But I feel like observability is like it's the meta feedback loop, right? It's the fundamental, it's feedback loops in complex systems, they can either be amplifying or dampening. Most of the ones in software are amplifying. The farther upstream you make a change, the greater the downstream impact, the easier it is to deal with. And observability, I sometimes use the metaphor, it's like I'm super blind, it's like putting your glasses on before you go barreling down the freeway at 80 miles an hour. The goal is to have the kind of sense making with your production systems so that instead of veering, you're just like, it just feels like driving, right? You're reacting, you're course correcting so quickly because you can see and get these feedback loops so quickly that it just feels like building, right? It doesn't feel like up, down, bad, good, whatever. You're just building. That's the goal. Even what was it, the thing that even like if you have like a 10-minute delay on your metrics or your aggregation window, brought us down, I think we fixed it, but we're not going to know for a few minutes. Harsh.
Yeah, it doesn't feel good.
It doesn't feel good. When you front-load good observability, it can make everything else faster and easier. And when you can't see what you're doing, everything else can be really hard.
And this is not necessarily technology specific, right? The idea of a feedback loop is your system talking to its components, including people that you have in there. It's generally something that we do with tech, and we might think of specific frameworks or specific ways of doing it, of common tools that we would be using. But the idea of getting feedback from a machine to a person is a general thing. From a machine to autoscale is a general thing. We rarely think about like feedback from people to people outside of meeting your managers, and we almost never think of feedback between people and machines to get them to do what we want. But those are all like key components of the stuff we have to do, and it's a general recipe that exists outside of just tech. It exists in teams in general, but it does exist in tech, and it is important there as well. And I like to ask a question like, how does Beam do observability in that pattern? Because I come from the Beam ecosystem. That's where I learned everything. And you have like, can you understand what's happening inside a system by asking questions from the outside? It's like, hell yeah, you can. There's nothing else that kind of matches it, going in the shell and there, running your commands, being able to do live tracing on places where people would spend like $1 billion instrumenting that stuff. You go, I'm just logging in and getting all that information right now. Nobody needs any of that. Can you figure out what transpired and what the states were in the past? Yes, generally you can. Most languages have ways of doing that stuff. Can you answer new questions without shipping new code? Yes, and it is really fantastic. You get in there, you can do a little hook, run an experiment, you evaluate some stuff, and you get the answer. I've not used any other tech that could beat that. However, it gets a bit weirder when you ask this question. Can you do this without prior knowledge? And the answer is no. Like, I ended up writing Erlang in Anger because I needed to not be the only person on my team doing this. You need to train them. It's a lot of work. It's very technical. Nobody really understands it. Other teams, you tell them, like, hey, I need help to debug something on the Beam. Like, you're on your own. Like, I don't even want to be in the same room as whatever tech you're using because it's foreign and it's different. And, like, can you find out how the users are doing? It's a bit harder if you're in the depth of your component and its infrastructure and the user is talking to something else. Like, you start needing to go broader. Then you have a question like, can product, sales, finance, support use your observability to help debug a thing or support a customer? And generally, this is where we start having weaknesses with what is within the Beam as a component, is that it's really rare that someone from sales is going to log on the virtual machine to find an answer to the bug. It's going to be escalated with you. You're going to need to help them. But there are observability patterns where these questions can be asked from your team, and they are accessible. It doesn't mean that you can't do the stuff in the Beam. It means that if you really want to play nicely with the rest of your organization, you have to sometimes go for less powerful tools in the local for something that is much better at the organizational or team level. That's once again like optimizing for the social technical element that you have in there. And yeah, the great tech is only great when it empowers teams' feedback cycle. Amazing tech that nobody knows what to deal with is just a really great black box. It's not a superpower, it's just a thing that you have. But when you have a way to have these good interactions with something, it becomes something you leverage that empowers people, and that participates itself in that feedback loop that you have.
We showed this slide earlier. Thought we may as well show it again. It hasn't really changed in a decade other than the one that Fred added. It was founded in 2015. God, I can't believe that was 10 years ago. None of this is new. But I feel like we can sometimes, like there's a lot of fear and like AI is coming, there's a lot of anxiety. Don't get me wrong, there are plenty of very good reasons for people to have anxiety in the world today. When it comes to like tech and the future of engineering and our jobs though, I feel actually, I'm not an optimist. I mean, come on, I come from SRE, like it's not, is it going to fail? Of course it's going to fail. When is it going to fail is the right question, right? How is it going to fail? When is it going to fail? It's just a matter of time, right? Which is why they don't usually let ops engineers found companies. VCs don't like that. But I feel like this should be, honestly, a pretty optimistic message. Like, nostalgia aside, there was a lot of bullshit in the old way of doing things. Engineering classism, where some people are too good to be put on call, some people are too valuable to be asked to debug things. ops like just being run into the ground, burnout, just being like, happens to everyone, it's just a matter of time, right? Or people who have more power flexing it over the people who don't and burning them out, right? A lot of mistrust, a lot of dislike. Remember, anyone else here old enough to remember the Bastard Operator from Hell? BOFH? Hell yeah. And the reason for a lot of that was because our systems were so fragile. Yeah, there was a lot of, don't you touch my production system, because if you look at it slightly wrong, it's gonna go down and nobody's gonna understand it. We have learned so much and built systems that have come so far over the past couple decades. We've learned that treating each other badly is a recipe for really shitty systems. We've learned that burning people out is also bad for our systems. As embodied beings, our mental health, our emotional state, our sense of safety and belonging, our relationships, all of these affect the quality of our work directly. What we all want out of work is, as Dan Pink says, autonomy, mastery, and meaning. And just so happens that building socio-technical systems with these tenets is the best, most sustainable way to get the best work out of people. People want to do great work.
Yeah.
People want to improve. You really have to beat that desire out of someone because we're born with it. Babies, one of the things that brings them the most joy is like pushing on something. Oh, it moves, hilarious. They just cackle and go. We love having an impact on the world and tightening up the feedback loops of, operating your code is putting you in touch with its impact on real users, right? Its impact on the business. There's something deeply, intrinsically just satisfying about that. We've learned that when you power through a bunch of toil and all-nighters, it makes your systems fragile, expensive to build and operate. We've learned that creating an environment where learning is foregrounded and communication is valued is good for engineers. It's what builds those world-class engineers that everyone wants to track down and pay ungodly amounts of money. No shade, Facebook paid for my house. Blood money paid for my house in SF. I do not blame you for taking blood money, if that's what needs to happen. But these arguments don't get made automatically. Like, I feel like this is a thing that, there are a lot of execs out there or financial folks who are not going to be like, oh, they're gonna be like, oh, great, yeah, you want to treat people we're in wartime, but like, this doesn't happen automatically. It takes champions, right? It takes experienced folks to make the pitch, to make the case, to connect the dots, to argue for why this makes sense for business, right? This makes sense for orgs. This is like real bottom line results. So, it takes credibility and champions, and I hope we can do that. That's all.
Thank you so much. Really, really inspiring. Loved it. I was sitting up in the front row, and a quote from Dan North kind of came to mind. One of my favorite quotes from Dan North, which is, a senior developer can't call themselves a senior developer until they've had to clean up a mess they've created themselves.
That tracks.
So, any questions? Yeah, we'll start with Casey.
Hi, Charity. Hi,
Hey,
Fred.
Casey.
So you posited at the end there that what's good for people is good for business results. You didn't mention Westrum, but what you're describing is like a generative culture where communication is promoted and valued and rewarded, and people are focused on optimizing communication. In contrast to a company that's pathological, where people shoot messengers and focus on
Yes,
power
thank you.
dynamics. So, yes, I think everyone would agree they would rather work at the generative organization. However, the most successful companies in history appear to be pathological ones. So do you have evidence that it is actually good for business, or perhaps we just shouldn't care so much what's good for business, but rather what's best for the people who work in it?
I would probably challenge that with a little easy question, which is, do you think that when you've had a good night of sleep, you produce better work than when you've had a shitty night of sleep? And generally, the answer is going to be yes. There's a qualitative argument that, yeah, you can drive people into a hole and crush them to powder and make a lot of money out of that. And the more money you have, the easier it is to do that repeatedly and just like throw more bodies in the machine. But from a more local point of view of what is possible for us to change, trying to hit these points of sustainability is a very real and practical way in which we can improve our own conditions in a way that has like material impact on the success of whatever our unit of work is. So it's not that universally it's impossible to burn people out into money, but there are ways in which well-rested people are going to give you something better than someone who is tired and about to break down all the time.
I think Casey's not challenging that.
No.
What I would say is, I have a couple of things come to mind. First of all, I think that, so I was at Facebook until 2014. And I think at the time I was there, 8,000-ish people, I think they worked very hard to, I don't think they 100% succeeded, but I think that they worked very hard to try to build a culture of high achievement and that was internally generative. And I think that Google did a decent job of it I think that they made more business mistakes. I do think Google is now just like burning through that. Boy, I have some stories that I'll tell you after class. But I think that honestly, the biggest, best tech companies in the world got to where they are by trying to be it. And I think that, which kind of brings me to point number 2, which is that people will stay at a shitty place if you give them a lot of money. Netflix also, I would argue, has tried really hard.
Microsoft, Apple, Amazon, like places that are like stereo.
All right, Amazon, yeah. But you said the most successful, and I'm just like, no. The other thing I would say is this. I think that a lot of us have accepted that that's just the way it is. You have to. And I feel like I would like to challenge all of us to not reward pathological companies with our labor. I think that, this is kind of why I said what I said about knowing it can be better and not staying there. I know so many people who have been in the same job for a long time, and they're just like, yeah, but is there anything better out there? Yeah, probably. And I feel like now, like everyone in this room has skill sets that are rare, specific, highly valued. And people have also got mortgages, right, and college bills, and I'm not trying to guilt trip anyone, but I feel like there are places out there that are trying to not be pathological, and we should try to reward them with our labor. Because your labor is a reward. Yes, you're being paid for it. Hopefully you're being paid very well. But people have options, often more options than they think.
Yeah.
Great question, though. It's a hard one.
Challenge.
Okay, I have a question. Thank you for your great talk. Do you think that technical observability should be kept separate from like user-level product type of observability and tracking?
I think that, honestly, source, Fred and I were just talking about this, when you have everybody looking at a different view of reality, that's what creates silos. And I think that like when you can unify around a source of truth, I think conversations about resources and trade-offs and goals become so much easier. And I think that where observability is trending, it's going from this multiple pillars world to every startup except one in the observability space since 2021 that I can think of has had a unified source of truth with arbitrarily wide structured data blobs packed in a columnar store. I think the 3 pillars model is dying faster than people realize. And I think that we're moving towards a data lake type model for observability where engineering adjacent teams can use AI actually to get some insights out of it.
The other thing I would say is that it's not necessarily that the data needs to be different, it's that you need to be able to build different representations from the same data that you have. It's possible that if you're an engineer working on a specific component, you're gonna love the logs in there that are sequential based on the operations you have. If you're looking into how a user interacted with the system to know where the bug is to route the thing, you're going to be looking at a higher level of traces probably, for example. But there is a way to jump across them. And what happens is that if you consider your users who are looking at observability like users and not just people at whom you throw garbage and you go figure it out, idiot, you end up building these affordances of going like, hey, you want to look at it from a user flow, you want to look at it from like this part of the request, you can use the same data to build these different perspectives. And so one of the problems that we tend to have in making operable software is that we're our own users, and so all the things that we write are going to be instrumentation from the point of view of someone who knows the code. And there is a need to have this mindset of going like, what is someone investigating this from the support team going to need, and adding that to the data. It's not that you necessarily need to have a whole different stack of observability, it's that you need to support these multiple stakeholders within the data that exists. And even if you have like 500 services, like the pattern I've seen time and time again, is for each of the services, there's going to be 1 or 2 types of span or events that everyone uses because they have key information. And the rest is details that you only dig into when something is weird, but there's only like some high-level salient points everywhere in your system that everybody latches into. So you need to be able to pivot from the high-level stuff to the low-level stuff, and that can be done with the same data. But yeah, it requires some support and some thinking to do properly.
Data is made valuable through context, I think. So the more context and relational information you're able to store, the more it's going to be usable and reusable by a bunch of different use cases. But everybody should definitely still be paging themselves on CPU heat maps. That was a joke.
Any other questions?
Thank you for your talk. It was quite enjoyable. For those that might be a few layers in, when you talk about being layers and layers in of effort, what advice do you have for them who may share the same sentiments to try to promote the changes in culture and speed and development and all of these great things you talked about?
You called it.
Yeah. One of the ways I like to personally define culture is that it's not a thing that exists. It's how we name the sort of aggregation of the outcomes of the decisions and prioritizations we make day in and day out. And it's really, really hard to change organizational culture because you're talking about changing how people prioritize and make decisions in the large. It is, however, very easy to create a local counterculture because you talk to your teammates and you go like, going forward, we do this instead. And then you do that and your team has a different culture from the rest of the company. And so it's going to be really hard to have change the whole org. It's going to be impossible in some ways. And the thing you're going to want to do is leave for a company where you don't have to fight that hard. However, yeah, I still think it is possible for a lot of times to create that local oasis of the right culture of things that you think work well. And if you're delivering good results about that, other peers elsewhere in the organization are going to like, what are you doing that works? And that's how it sort of spreads bottom up. And if it works and it spreads plenty, then you can get maybe a director or someone higher up that goes like, this is a good idea. And then you get the top-down support to make it greater. That's going to take years. That's going to take a lot of work. It's easy to get started, and it's forever work to get it moving forward.
There's a quote that I read somewhat recently, which is that culture is forged through expensive actions, which I love. I'm just setting that there to the side. My first question would be, what level are you?
I'm a director of engineering.
Manager. Even you're like, oh, I don't think there's any managers here. You know, because when someone asks me that, if they are junior or first 5 to 7 years of their engineering career, I'm like, don't try. Like, don't. And if you are a woman or whatever, put that out of your mind. Like, try to just, this is very like not politically correct, but like your job, your only job is to get you from where you are to senior, right? Be selfish, right? Become senior. Buy yourself some of that credibility. Buy yourself, and then develop a thin skin on behalf of others, right? Get yourself some power first, then use it to like try to change things. I think that senior ICs tend to have more power than they realize. Mostly, like Fred said, doing something that works, kind of unusual. Actually, it shouldn't be as rare and unusual as it is, but like engineering superpowers of doing, right? Doing, building, changing, and if you can do and gain some higher level support, you really can change things if your senior leadership is not like actively, aggressively opposed. If they are, you just cut your losses and go. But like even with passive or sort of supportive, but not really like crusading supportive leadership, I think senior ICs can like do incredible things. Someone at the director layer, in my opinion, directors run the company. And I think directors have more power than VPs at a well-run company to actually set the standards for behavior, hold people accountable, impact hiring processes, firing processes, ask hard questions when something sounds a little fishy, you hold managers to a high standard. Like one of the most dangerous things in an organization is a toxic manager. Just the ripples of like, it's so much more dangerous than senior ICs, and it's really hard for ICs to hold managers accountable, and directors often can. But it's a long question with a lot of details.
There's an interesting double edge there where if you've worked on some startups that were growing, you've seen sometimes like they hire one director who brings in all of their friends from management and the entire culture shifts right away.
Immediately.
But you've also seen the opposite where one manager or director is trying to enact change and they apply a new framework and nobody gives a shit. They just ignore it and keep doing what they were doing. And both of things can happen at the same time in different parts. There are changes that you're going to try to make that if they don't reflect the reality that people have, they're just going to be able to disregard and keep doing what they were doing. And there are places where you don't realize by choosing who is in the organization, you multiply and you propagate the type of decision you would make by hiring all your buddies, and eventually the culture changes that way as well.
Yep, what he said.
Okay, let's hear it for Charity and Fred. Thank you.